Okay, so today I'm taking you to Poland with me, and I'm going to show you something that Poland is really known for, which are fermented foods. I will show you a couple of recipes, both very traditional and a bit less traditional, to hopefully give you some inspiration of how you can incorporate more of these fermented foods into your diet. But I will also give you some scientific background behind fermented foods. Why are they actually good for us and what to pay attention to when buying them? If you don't care about the sciencey bit and came here just for the food, you can jump to the timestamp shown on the screen. Okay, so even though fermentation is an age-old process, it's really had a big comeback in recent years, and I'm sure you've noticed. Properly fermented foods can not only boost the nutritional value of what we eat, but can also benefit our gut microbiome. If you're not familiar with what is gut microbiome, which will be quite central to this discussion, I will link a video down below explaining in a little bit more detail what it is. But in short, it's a living ecosystem of trillions of microbes, predominantly bacteria, but also viruses and fungi that live in your large intestine. A healthy gut microbiome, which according to our current understanding is basically a diverse microbiome, has not only been linked with better digestion, but also with brain health, with heart health, and many others. And the discovery between the link of the gut microbiome and different disease and health states has been such a huge paradigm shift that scientists have come up with all kinds of different ways to modify the gut microbiome in order to test if it actually has an impact on different health outcomes. And one of the most intimidating ways in which they try to do that is a poop transplant. I actually had the pleasure of witnessing this procedure when I was interning at a hospital in Amsterdam. So what researchers would basically do is take a stool sample from a healthy donor and dilute it in a liquid to form like a homogeneous microbiome-rich solution, and then deliver it to the gut of the recipient in hopes that the gut microbiome of the donor would colonize the gut of the recipient. The procedure usually involves inserting a tube through your mouth and throat all the way down to the large intestine. And after the transplant, doctors would monitor, first of all, whether the colonization was successful, and if it was, how does it affect disease outcomes for that particular patient. But the good news is that you don't have to go through such great lengths to affect your gut microbiome, and probably the easiest and least revolting way of affecting it is through your diet. And this is precisely where fermented foods come in. When traditionally prepared, these foods can contain live bacteria that can interact with your gut microbiome and your immune system in positive ways. And while they might not colonize your gut permanently, they still can have positive effects just by passing through. As a side note, this is why it's better to consume fermented foods regularly in small quantities rather than frequently in large amounts. But there are a couple of important considerations when it comes to fermented foods. So first of all, the types of bacteria that will be contained within a fermented food will vary depending on how it was prepared and what kind of substrate was used for fermentation. So in this case, how can we know what kind of bacteria are present in the fermented food and whether they can really have a positive impact on our health? And it turns out that we actually cannot be sure unless a food is labeled as a probiotic or containing probiotics. According to the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics, a probiotic is a product that needs to meet two criteria. First of all, it must contain bacteria strains that are actually proven to have a specific impact on human health. And secondly, it must contain enough of these bacteria to actually make a difference. And even though the vast majority of fermented foods will not meet either of these criteria, they can still be appropriately labeled as containing probiotics if at least one bacteria strain within the food belongs to a larger group of bacteria that have been very well studied and have been shown to positively affect human health. But still, a vast majority of fermented food products still won't be labeled as containing probiotics because they are either produced by spontaneous fermentation or using specific starter cultures, which produce diverse bacteria communities, but ones that aren't very well defined. And so the big question is, does it still make sense to eat fermented foods if we don't really know what types of bacteria are in them and in what quantities? And it turns out that yes, it might. So in this randomized controlled trial from Stanford, researchers split the participants into two groups. The first group was on a high fiber diet and the second group was on a high fermented food diet. Participants in the fermented foods group basically were requested to increase their fermented foods intake to about 6 servings per day, and the serving sizes differed depending on the food that they consumed. The participants followed their diets for 10 weeks and the results were really amazing. So the participants in the fermented foods group showed significantly lower levels of inflammation compared to baseline, which is quite a big deal because inflammation is a marker of many disease states. And secondly, they also showed a greater microbiome diversity after the intervention, not only in comparison to baseline, but also in comparison to the high fiber group. And the authors concluded that it's not necessarily that fiber is bad. We definitely should not conclude that, but it's likely that the gut microbiome changes on a high fiber diet would just take longer to develop than the duration of the study. But the key question is, what kind of fermented foods were the participants eating? Were the foods labeled as containing probiotics, or were they just widely available fermented foods that me and you can find in a local supermarket? Their methodology section didn't go into quite as much detail, so I emailed the leading scientist of the study, Professor Christopher Gardner, and him and his team were kind enough to respond and clarify that participants were not instructed to specifically choose probiotic-containing fermented foods. So what does that actually tell us? Based on the study, even if we're not completely sure what is the specific bacteria composition of the fermented food we eat, it seems like fermented foods can still confer a positive health effect in healthy individuals. In other words, the fermented foods you choose in a grocery store don't necessarily have to be labeled as containing probiotics, as long as they contain live bacteria cultures and have not been pasteurized, which basically inactivates the live bacteria and renders the fermented food basically useless for your gut microbiome. Or actually does it? In fact, contrary to the common belief that pasteurization reduces the value of a fermented food for our gut microbiome, we're actually not quite sure if that's the case. And to explain why that is, let me pull up a paper that was published just a couple of days ago by the same Stanford group that had published the paper I discussed a minute ago. So the authors of this review explained that the bacteria involved in fermentation, which are also referred to as fermentation-associated microbes, or FAMs for short, produce certain metabolites during the fermentation, and those metabolites are referred to as fermentation-derived metabolites, or FDMs for short. So simplistically speaking, a fermented food that hasn't been pasteurized contains both the FAMs, so the live bacteria, and the metabolites that they have produced in the process of fermentation. Now, when the product gets pasteurized, the FAMs get deactivated in the process and turn into something that's referred to as postbiotics. So these are inactive microorganisms or their components that can confer a health benefit to the host. Meanwhile, the FDMs stay intact. So a pasteurized food, instead of containing FAMs, contains this postbiotics and FDMs as well. And as of now, we're actually not quite sure what is the relative importance of FAMs versus FDMs in conferring a positive health effect when consuming fermented foods. To illustrate this with an example, there was a small randomized controlled trial in IBS patients that showed that the consumption of both unpasteurized and pasteurized sauerkraut led to significant changes in microbiome composition. And while the authors concluded that it is probably because of the prebiotic content of sauerkraut, basically the substrate that bacteria can feed on, it might as well be that it was the FDMs that actually contributed to this positive change in microbiome composition. But for now, we're just not really sure. So what does that actually mean for me and you? Well, first of all, we need to keep in mind that the controlled trials on fermented foods are still quite small scale, and we don't yet have large definitive data sets, which basically means that we can't make definitive health statements on the benefits of fermented foods on health just yet. But the data that we do have so far is really promising. So fermented foods seem to be increasing gut microbiome diversity and decreasing inflammation in healthy individuals, even when we don't really know what specific microbes are in them. And while researchers are still figuring out how this benefit is actually happening, whether it's the live microbes, their byproducts, or maybe even the inactive microbial components, it's probably probably safest to assume that the live microbes play a role, and as an extension select fermented foods that are labeled as containing live bacteria cultures or something along the lines. So for example, you can see that the label of this product clearly states that there are live cultures present, and this one on the other hand has been pasteurized and probably doesn't contain the live microbes, which again doesn't necessarily mean it wouldn't confer, a health benefit. So with all that being said, let me now show you a couple of traditional and a bit less traditional Polish recipes to hopefully inspire you to incorporate more of fermented foods into your diet. Okay, so let's start with a typical Polish dinner, kasza gryczana z maślanką. So the fermented food here is maślanka, which is a traditional Polish buttermilk, a tangy, slightly thick fermented dairy drink made from the liquid left after churning butter. So in this particular dish, you simply cook some buckwheat, which is a hulled grain, and that means that only their tough, inedible outer shells have been removed, but the fiber-rich part is still intact. Here I actually slightly overcooked mine, but it was still okay. So actually usually my grandma would mix the buckwheat with butter-baked onions to add some flavor, but I can't eat onions, so I just had it plain. You would then usually serve it with cold maślanka, and although it wouldn't be my go-to dinner, it really is quite refreshing and light, especially during hot summer days. Next, we have something very special. We're going to make 2 fermented salads alongside a main meal, which in this case was kluski śląskie. These are basically potato dumplings, and although they aren't the fermented food in this dish, you can't deny that they are the shining star here. So these are basically potato dumplings with a meat filling. And to make them, we started by prepping the potatoes. And my grandma really wanted me to tell you that when the potatoes are old, you need to cut off a very thick layer instead of just the thin skin of the potato. So while the potatoes were cooking, we made the very first salad, which was made of homemade fermented cucumbers. And my grandma basically makes these cucumbers by filling a jar with water, adding some garlic, dill. I didn't quite understand what she's adding there specifically, and also chrzan, which actually, let me see, how would you translate it to English? Horseradish to this mixture, and then lets it ferment for I don't know how long. So to prep the salad, my grandma chopped some broth cooked carrots and also the fermented cucumber. She would also normally add fresh onions, but since I can't eat them, she went to get some fresh spring onion from her garden. Then added some fresh pepper, and actually funny story, the peppermill you can see here belonged to my great-grandma, and she apparently received it for her wedding as her wedding gift. So it dates over 8 years and it's been passed on to my grandma and will probably passed on to my mom and then maybe to me. Then my grandma added a little bit of oil and she combined it all together and it was done. In the meantime, potatoes cooked and my grandma mashed them and placed them tightly at the bottom of a plastic bowl. She scraped off about 1/4 of the potato mash as a way to measure how much potato flour she needs to add to keep the proportions right. So she never actually uses weighing scales and everything she does is always eyeballed, but always turns out so good. She then added an egg and mixed it all into one consistent batter that's quite thick and heavy. She then formed sort of cups of this batter and filled it up with a meat mixture and then just closed it up to form a ball. This time she prepared the meat mixture ahead of time because she had some leftover meat from a broth she prepared, so she just seasoned it with baked onion, salt and pepper and some maggi. Then she went ahead and formed more kluski śląskie from the batter and then cooked them in boiling water. I also asked her how long does it actually take to cook, but she seems to eyeball this as well. So can't tell you. Here you can also see her warming up some pork fat to pour over the kluski once they are ready. My grandma is absolutely obsessed with this pork fat, and she would pour it over sweet oatmeal only if she could. As the kluski were cooking, we made the second salad made of sauerkraut, which I chopped thinly, added some rasped apple and a little bit of chives and also some carrot, but just for color, really. Once the kluski were ready, my grandma served them with the pork fat, and even though I told her I wanted just a tiny bit, she was very, very generous on the fat. We then added a side of sauerkraut salad and fermented cucumber salad, which can really be served with any type of dinner. So kluski śląskie are just an example, but it could go just as well with grilled chicken and quinoa, for example. And I must say, this was so good. I absolutely love this dish. It must be one of my favorites, and if you ever visit Poland, please don't skip on it. It's probably a lesser known dish to foreigners, but it's so good. And I'd say it's probably on par with pierogi, which actually seem much more popular. I can't promise a restaurant version would be just as good as my grandma's, probably not, but you should still try it. Next, I have two fermented food snacks for you. So the first one is a smoothie made of frozen berries and kefir, which is thicker than maślanka. So my grandma basically blends the berries and kefir together, and I actually did a quick Google search, and apparently blending shouldn't disrupt the good bacteria contained in kefir. I couldn't really find any studies supporting that, but in this case I will just believe Reddit. This makes an absolutely great afternoon snack on a hot day, and it's so tasty. My grandma also insisted on adding some homemade blackcurrant syrup, which added some more antioxidants, also some sweetness and color to the smoothie. Truly delicious. The second snack was homemade fermented beetroot, and my grandma said it's super easy to prepare, but she didn't really go into details. So it's a bit sour, tangy, and aromatic with garlic and all kinds of herbs my grandma added.
Delicja. No właśnie.
She also insisted I try the fermented beetroot juice, which didn't steal my heart, if I'm honest. Next, I have a breakfast option, which isn't really a Polish dish, but it's still a great way to introduce some fermented foods into your diet. It's an avocado toast with poached eggs and sauerkraut, plus some spicy sauce. So I first start by chopping the sauerkraut into smaller pieces. In the meantime, set the water to boil for the eggs and toast some bread. I poach the eggs and get them out after 3 minutes for the yolk to continue being nice and runny. And then it's time to assemble it. I mash the avocado on toast, add the sauerkraut and poached eggs, and drizzle with spicy sauce like Tabasco or sriracha if you like some heat. And that's about it. Enjoy. You actually can't tell on my face here, but this was really, seriously super good. I also had to share some sauerkraut with chili because she absolutely loves all kinds of veggies and loves snacking on paprika and carrots, and is apparently also a huge fan of sauerkraut as well. Next up, we have żurek, which is a traditional Polish soup made from fermented rye flour, giving it a sour flavor and usually cooked with sausage and eggs. The beneficial bacteria likely won't survive the boiling process, but as we discussed earlier, it's actually possible that the fermentation metabolites could still be supporting the microbiome even after cooking, though this is not really certain. So my grandma starts by preparing a veggie broth with some cooked veggies and herbs. Then you basically add this sort of żurek ready-made mixture, which was store-bought, and I'm not sure if she ever makes the mixture herself. Then you set it to a boil, and in the meantime I prepared the add-ons. So I chopped and fried some Polish sausages of different kinds. The first one was just regular white sausage with like a lot of herbs. So there's majoram, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah, it's very herby, and there's also some garlic. It's very tasty. And we also added some smoked sausage and ham. I also prepped some hard-boiled eggs by just peeling them and chopping them and placed everything into a small bowl. And once the soup was ready, I poured it over the sort of add-ons. It's a soup we usually have only once a year, and I absolutely love it. It has a bit of a sour and tangy flavor, and I'm not sure if foreigners would actually enjoy it. I think it might be one of those things you need to be used to eating from your childhood onwards to actually appreciate the taste. And actually, Polish cuisine is full of this type of dishes. Maybe I'll make a video at some point on some of the most funky / revolting dishes that Poland has seen. Let me know if that would be of interest. And by the way, I love them all. Last but not least, I prepared a pate sandwich with fermented cucumber, which can be either eaten as breakfast or as a snack. Here, similarly to the fermented beetroot juice, a cucumber juice can also be drank, and my grandma absolutely swears by its health properties. Unsurprisingly, it's quite sour, tangy, and actually really salty. But anyways, you prep the sandwich by simply cutting the cucumber into thin slices, toasting some bread, and spreading some pate over the toast. Here I'm using a chicken pate from the butcher, and the quality and taste were really nice. You place the cucumber over the pate and enjoy. So yeah, that would be it. I hope it gave you some inspiration on how you can potentially incorporate more fermented foods into your daily diet. I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time. Bye.